Well, thanks everybody for being here. One thing, we're going to have probably 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. So if folks could pass their cards to the aisle so they can be collected as you think of things to write down and ask. I want to start by asking Lynn and Andy to explain their involvement in the project and how the film came to be, and their background in making it. So why don't you guys begin with that?
You want to start?
Yeah. So I started working with Patrick in 1988 when he moved to New Mexico, and exhibited most of his bodies of work over about a 30-year period. During this time, Patrick got cancer in 2004. And in 2014, when it came back, we did an exhibition of the tapestry work in the race. And I started talking to him about my legacy project of informing what an artist does with oral history. So that when somebody looks at the work in the future, 100 years from now, they don't just make up stuff. They can make up stuff, but at least they'll have some information that the artist has provided as to how he made the prints, what he was thinking about, what projects led to other projects. So in Patrick's case, Patrick was the consummate director. The interviewing was very easy. I enlisted some of my friends, Miguel Gandert, who was faculty at UNM and an old friend of Patrick, Michelle Penhall, who had done one of his retrospective exhibitions, Andrew Connor, who was a curator and now director of the Albuquerque Museum. And so the idea was to start with the life interview and then present a catalog resume. And there were other things that I was trying to accomplish. One was to have the film informed by the artist's work. And when looking at the making of the movie, the idea was not to have the interviewers there. But in this case, it's like you're going to the studio and Patrick's talking to you about his work. So another thing that you witnessed tonight was you looked at probably 450 images, almost the entire body of Patrick's mature work. So within the 52 minutes of the film, not only did you hear his opinions, but in a certain way now you have a familiarity with his entire body of work. So we had done the raw footage, 15 hours of shooting, and then I had mentioned this to Lynn Estomin, and Lynn was an old childhood friend. Our parents were best friends when we were growing up in different states, and we would visit. And through different experiences, we had encountered Patrick. I had been working with him. Lynn, who was a professor of photography at Lycoming College, had invited him out to give some presentations, become friends with him over the years. And so it became a labor of love. The smallest part was the interviewing. The largest part was the amount of time Lynn spent editing, cutting, directing. And then the third person who was involved was Patrick's brother Scott, who was a musician and composer who composed the music and the musical score for the film.
So I was honored and humbled to be invited to collaborate on this project. And I say collaborate not only because it had started before I was part of it, but mostly because Patrick really was a collaborator. He was very involved in shaping the film and deciding what was going to go in and what was going to go out. I made the decision early on that I didn't want any interviewers. I wanted Patrick to tell his story. My other goal was to make a film that a popular audience could relate to on one level or another. My goal was to get it on PBS, and it will be shown nationally on PBS starting in July.
Congratulations.
But that brought its own problems in, which were there are time limits for PBS. So I had, by the time I did some research and found some archival footage of him working in the studio, we're talking about roughly 25 hours of Patrick talking. And I had to cut it down to 52 minutes, including the credits. And Patrick had 200 people he wanted to thank in the credits. So some of you may have seen your name in the credits. If you did, congratulations. So the biggest issue with this was figuring out how to cut it down and how to make it into a story that was cohesive. And Patrick's work is very different. I mean, each series is something unto itself. And so I had to try to figure out how to tie all the different imagery together. There were a lot of possibilities for doing it. We ended up basically doing it chronologically. You know, one of the other issues was whenever an artist is working on a particular project, that's the most important project to them at that time. And at the time I was editing the film, Patrick was working on the novel. And as a really creative person, he never stopped creating. When he couldn't work in the studio anymore, he said, oh, I'm going to write a novel, which he did, and it was published. But visually, it wasn't the same as his other photographic work. I had 15 images to work with, and he wanted the 15 images basically just straight. And it wasn't really enough visually to engage people. And, you know, there were all kinds of other issues, like a video screen is a rectangle, and most of his images were square. And so there was a question of, how are you going to fill the screen? Initially, he didn't want any of his images cropped. And as a photographer, I understand not wanting somebody else to come in and crop the edges off of your images. But we came to an agreement that at some point I would show the entire image, but that I could zoom in. And part of that wasn't just filling this frame. It was about the intensity and the detail in his work. That, you know, you've got a Scrabble board and every single word says something about nuclear energy, nuclear war. And so I wanted people, especially if they weren't going to be seeing it on a beautiful big screen like this, to be able to get the detail of the work.
One of the things that comes to mind in hearing you talk about, you know, him being very much an author of this as well, is, you know, he's the consummate directorial, you know, mode photographer. And we had a long conversation this afternoon about Patrick's work and Andy and Lynn's friendship with him, and I think it'd be interesting to hear some anecdotal sort of stories that came out this afternoon about, you know, Patrick being in that mode as you both engage with him in this project. Sort of him sort of taking the kind of role he has as a photographer in his pictures over into the context of the film, and to talk more about the way he worked as a photographer in his pictures.
Yeah,
too.
well, let me back up a minute. One of the things that made Patrick different than other photographers, that he was a real pioneer in the modern iteration of constructed photography. In the 1980s, he and Gregory Crutzen and Cindy Sherman more or less redefined a lot of the language and of how people were making photographs. And when he first went to Polaroid, he talked about wanting to do something different, wanting to do something that nobody else could or would do. And his skills as a model maker and his consummate skills as a craftsman led and drove a lot of his photography, his manipulation with his hands of making models. He started as a kid, and he never stopped making models. When he worked in the movies on I think it was the Star Wars set, he learned from one of the great Hollywood fabricators how to use force field perspective. And so the amount of obsessive craft that went into each project was astounding. I mean, he would come up with the idea, but the making of the images in the Polaroids, they might make half a dozen sets over a period of a year, and then they would go shoot them over a period of reconstructing each set over a couple of days. So this made it very interesting to work with Patrick. And when we started the interviewing, I've done a number of other interviews with a number of other artists, but Patrick was self-directed. When we sat down to do the life interview, 3-hour interview, he had it thought out, and he basically conducted the interviewed himself. And we just sat there and watched and kind of recorded. Every now and then somebody might throw out a question, but the question was either going to be answered later or had already been answered.
Yeah, he had a very clear idea of what he wanted in the film, and we'd bounce some ideas off, and there were things like he said, well, maybe animate the planes. So I animated 15 planes, and it was like, I don't like the planes animated. And his reasoning made absolute sense, because he said, they're beautiful, but that's not me. I'm not an animator. And so he was very good at always pulling things back to exactly what he wanted his legacy to be.
Yeah, and to be clear, he was dying when we were doing the interviews. Right. This was clear to him, this was clear to all of us. Right. Chemo sessions were regular every month, every 3 weeks. We would have to time our interviews between his chemo sessions, when he was past his chemo brain and before he was feeling badly enough that he needed to go in for another chemo session. So usually there was, within a 3-week period, there was 4 or 5 days when he would either consent to interviews, or he might go and indulge in his other passion. One of his main passions was gambling. He was a great gambler, a great card player. And he would go and binge for 24 or 48 hours at the Isleta Pueblo casino and just gamble. And that was one of his great joys of his life.
And something that fit into a lot of his storytelling. He meets Ryochi at a casino, and the cards are a big part of some of the Polaroid work that he's working in. The other way in which Patrick worked was he was very obsessive, but he did a lot of research into what he was doing. He was constantly reading, and it might not have been the kind of research that you think of when you think of researching a project, but he was looking at things from 20 different angles and figuring out the minutest details. What kind of sand would have been in this particular dig if in fact it were real, because he wanted it to feel real. And he absolutely loved the fact that whenever the excavation work was shown, people thought it was real. I mean, this is pre-Photoshop days. They're done with little models that are beautifully built so that they appear to be real. And people are going, wow, I was at Stonehenge. Where was that car? I didn't see that car.
Well, going back to the research piece, he says in one of the interviews I read by him, a quote that was, I would have been a historian if I hadn't been an artist, right? So, I mean, I think he had a keen sense of how much he liked delving into the information. And in the couple of times I interacted with him, I mean, it was very, being New Mexico neighbors, he knew the megatonnage and the place of manufacture and the location of test of every single one of those bombs, right? Knew the manufacture of the jet aircraft. And I mean, all of that obsessiveness definitely came out in the way he could account for all of the details and all of those images. So,
and another thing that was important about Patrick and the work was this mixture of science, understanding the science behind something, and then turning it into pseudoscience. Color healing versus color image making. And that leading into then truth in photography and what really is a photograph and how do you experience it and what is it that you're presenting in it. Is it an actual moment? Is it a fictional moment? Is it a creative moment?
And kind of collapsing narratives, right? Like taking the Anasazi iconography and conflating it with nuclear science in northern New Mexico and having all of that sort of gathered into a single image space. Sadly, we're 7:22 already, which how that went by so quickly. So we have some questions from the audience. I feel like we need to make sure we get to those. So one is people are interested in hearing about his work in the internment camps and how it's specific to his heritage, and then wants us to mention that we have items in the archive drawers here at the CCP. That relate to the Japanese American internment camps.
And we also have his estate, so we have a good selection of his work at the gallery as well. But the internment camp was very personal for Patrick. He came to it late. He was the least, he stated that he was the least involved in the family history of his family. His older brother, Nick, was very involved in the projects to bring the camps back into the national memory and to plaque them. And Patrick came to that later in his life and late in the project, but he embraced it. And because of the intimate family history, Santa Fe was home of one of the 4 main prison camps for dangerous Japanese men.
And his grandfather was there.
And his grandfather was there, and Patrick was living in Albuquerque. And it was all very personal. And he embraced it in a different way than he did the other groups, because he was rediscovering his own family history as he was photographing the camps.
But those connections do permeate other parts of his work, right? Because family on his father's side were living right outside of Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. So that it sort of cycles back around.
Well, the
nuclear enchantment and the Polaroid pieces, I mean, are all his wanting to deal with nuclear issues. And so it was a big part of his life, and the fact that Nick was an activist at the time that he was doing that earlier work influenced his work on that.
So another question, how did Buddhist practice inform his art making? Was he practicing? Is that part of what's in the tapestry work?
I think it was probably more meditative than Buddhist.
Right.
More obsessive and compulsive in a certain way that attracted Patrick's attention. And in my opinion, the obsessive compulsive art is sometimes the greatest art that we find.
But another part of it had to do with the women and deities, and a lot of Patrick was a feminist, and the novel, the tapestries, he made a big point of talking about switching from the male deities to the female deities and how important that was in the way that he looked at it. But over the period of 30 years when he was making the tapestries, it was basically a matter of meditation, not so much a formal Buddhism, although he did spend time with his parents, monk, when they were dying, and he was going out to take care of them.
Another question: where did he access the images that he taped? Where did those come from? The foundation?
They're all found.
Okay.
They were found in books and magazines mostly.
Yeah. Some of them came from museums, and some of the imagery in Nuclear Enchantment and in the excavations are also found images. I mean, some of the locations he went to, and some of them he didn't.
And in the race, actually, there's another photographer that actually took the landscapes. Then he made the models and inserted them through Photoshop.
Yeah.
So again, it was totally directorial. Somebody else was making the images, somebody was doing the writing. He would do some of the model making and kind of direct all the action. In each chapter of the 15 chapters of the race, each pilot has their reminiscence and what they're thinking about, and Patrick would kind of set out what those thoughts were before he sent the drafts off for the collaborators to fill in the details.
And you wanted an anecdote. One of the 9 writers had their, right, not counting him. One of them had the plane crash, commit suicide, and Patrick said no. And that not only did that not get in the book, but the writer was out.
Well, I think actually that was the last question, and we've got 2 minutes to spare. So, question from the audience. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
I was a student of Patrick's at UNM, and I was wondering if you could talk just for a minute about his legacy as an instructor there.
We only knew him through his reputation. He was considered the greatest photography professor there for his entire tenure. And he spoke, when we were doing the taping, he talked about learning to teach in high school. That is when he taught high school. So after he finished college, he taught in public high school for 12 years before he went back to graduate school. And he said that that's where he learned to teach. And he was the most effective teacher at UNM in the art department and the photography department. And when we had the kind of memorial service and showing for the film, a lot of his students came.
Including high school.
Yeah, including students from high school, and paid homage to just how inspirational he had been as a professor.
And I'll say, I was never Patrick's student, but he was very much a mentor to me. I met him 25 years ago at the Society for Photographic Education, and I learned a lot from him about how to make films on political subjects without beating your audience over the head. That in all of it, he was a very humble and generous man who, in my opinion, was brilliant, but was willing to work with people on a number of different levels. His students loved him.
We probably have time for one more if there's anybody else out in the audience.
Quickly, just because of what you said. You said he was very influential. No, it had to do with not being heavy-handed with political issues. Can you think of an example where what he said specifically? I know this is asking a lot, but because that fascinates me personally now, and I can't always put my finger on it. So I just wonder how he crystallized that, if he did.
Well, I think just through his work, if you look at the way that he deals with some pretty heavy subjects, but he does it in a way that gives the audience an entrance to it. Part of it is through the humor that he uses, which is often very dark humor, but it's a way of getting people to look at serious subjects and think about them in a different way. I mean, having all these wild constructed sets and stuff, it kind of makes you step back, but at the same time, you're being confronted with, you know, a group of Japanese Americans in kimonos with shades that are reflecting atom bombs going off.
And I think also in the nuclear enchantment work, you know, a lot of the work had to do with the victim.
Yeah.
But they're implied as much as they are actually shown.
But that would be a good example of something that he said when he's looking at the display at Los Alamos and saying, this is what isn't here. What's missing is humanity. And this is a display that should be there.
Well, that was a good note to end on. And thank you so much.